They don't want people to be able to think for themselves. What do they want? They want people who are going to be able to goose step to whatever the leadership wants. Welcome to the Patriotic Pulpit. You know, one of the signs that society itself is unraveling, that civilization itself is coming apart at the seams, is the assault on science, the scientific method, the assault on logic, the assault on reasoning. That's exactly what's happening at seemingly almost all levels. In the elementary education, high school education, collegiate education, graduate school, law schools, reasoning, scientific methods, drawing conclusions warranted by the evidence, these things are being cast aside for political agendas always, seemingly. And this is a sign that really we are losing our collective mind in society. I want to think for just a few moments about the left's assault on the scientific method. The scientific method, a very simple methodology by which we draw conclusions warranted from evidence. That very methodology is under assault by the left. And that, of course, is something that's part of the woke ideology. So the outline I want to follow is, number one, I want to talk about the scientific method for just a few moments. Number two, that consensus science is not science. That is counting noses on how many scientists agree on a particular issue, or how many scientists sign off on a particular thing. That really has nothing to do with real science. Number three, I want to mention the reaction to consensus science. A couple of scientists that I want to quote on that one. Number four, the left's assault on the scientific method. I have been reading, and I get an email from John Droz. John Droz is a scientist, and he has a great email on all of these things, and so I'm going to rely upon his material on some of these particular points. And so he has also number five, why the left hates the scientific method. So let's talk for a few moments about the scientific method. What is exactly the scientific method? Well, first of all, science itself, according to John Droz, and he's correct in this, is a process. The simplest, accurate definition of science is that science is a process which includes, it is comprehensive, it is objective, it is not subjective, it is transparent, it is not hidden, it doesn't have a political agenda, and it is empirical. That is, we can observe it with the five senses. If it does not meet that criteria, it's really not in the scientific realm. That's one reason, incidentally, that evolution, the general theory of evolution, is really not science. It's not really fitting into the scientific process because it is not empirical. It is not something that can be demonstrated and repeatable in a laboratory. So let's talk about for a moment the scientific method. It's the heart of science. The methodology that science actually has outlined, it's actually 4,000 years old, as John Droz points out. And the goal of the method is to discover the relationships between cause and effect with technical issues. The roots, of course, as I pointed out, go back thousands of years, 4,000 back into ancient Greece, ancient Rome. Now, the roots of the word scientific and method are knowledge and method, road. So the phrase scientific method literally means road to knowledge. And Webster's dictionary defines it as principles and procedures for the systematic pursuit of knowledge involving, number one, the recognition and articulation of a problem. This is really the scientific method. Recognition and articulation of a problem. Number two, collection of data through observation and experiment. And number three, the formulation and testing of hypotheses. In other words, the scientific method is a step-by-step problem-solving process. Now, note carefully that the scientific method does not include what we might call consensus science. Now, there's nothing more ridiculous than many people claiming that how many scientists believe a certain thing, and that therefore settles an issue. And we've heard, of course, the Barack Obamas of the world and the Joe Bidens of the world saying the debate is over regarding climate change because climate change, we are told, is real based upon, and it is man-caused, based upon the fact that so many scientists agree that climate change is human caused. And so one person said, I think it was Barack Obama actually said that he pontificated in one of the State of the Union speeches that 97% of all scientists agree that man, specifically American people, are the real polluters, and this is the cause of our climate emergency. So let's notice a couple of reactions to consensus science, but simply noting this, that counting noses is not science. It has to be verifiable by the scientific method. So Jonathan Drolls points out that science, as we've talked about, is physical observation, hypothesis, experimentation to test the hypothesis. It also includes results that are reproducible. It can only be reproduced in a laboratory or reproduced by experimentation. It has nothing to do with how many scientists believe a certain thing. One scientist in a laboratory can overturn an entire belief system of an entire scientific community, of an entire culture. One scientist in a laboratory. The late Michael Crichton, he had an earned medical degree from Harvard Medical School in 1969. In 2003, spoke at the California Institute of Technology at Pasadena, California. And he pointed out that consensus has nothing to do with science. And I want you to listen to what he has to say. I regard consensus science as an extremely pernicious development that ought to be stopped cold in its tracks. Historically, the claim of consensus has been the first refuge of scoundrels. It is the way to avoid debate by claiming that the matter is already settled. Whenever you hear the consensus of scientists agrees on something or other, reach for your wallet, for you're being had. Now let's stop the quote right there for just a moment. So when Barack Obama or Joe Biden tell us, or that the Academy tells us, the scientists in the Academy tell us, well, the science is settled, that climate change is occurring, and that it's man-caused, and they tell us that it's settled by so many scientists believing that that is exactly what Crichton's talking about. Consensus science, he said, that is the refuge of scoundrels. Continuing with his quote, let's be clear, the work of science has nothing whatsoever to do with consensus. Consensus is the business of politics. Now, let me just add this. That is exactly what the climate change so-called emergency is all about. It's all about politics. And the reason they quote so many scientists is because it's a political agenda. It's not really science has shown that climate change has occurred or that it has occurred by humans. But it is all a political agenda. And what is that political agenda? That political agenda is to curtail our freedom in America, to curtail our energy production, to curtail the advancement of humankind that America has led for over 200 years, and is to curtail that. That's what the socialists, the totalitarians, they have hated that America has led the way, and so they have conspired. Thousands and thousands of them conspired. Socialists, communists, Nazis, fascists, all of these conspired to bring down America, and they do it with consensus science. So continuing with Crichton, science, he quotes, on the contrary, requires only one investigator who happens to be right, which means that he or she has results that are verifiable by reference to the real world. In science, consensus is irrelevant. What are relevant are reproducible results. The greatest scientists in history are great precisely because they broke with consensus. There's no such thing as consensus science. If it's consensus, it isn't science. If it's science, it isn't consensus, period. What a great quote from Michael Crichton. He himself had a medical degree as scientist. Now you might notice, just as an illustration of this, Galileo Galilei had scientific or observable evidence that the earth actually revolved around the sun. But the scientists of the Catholic Church, it was all political, in the Middle Ages said, no, the earth is the center of the solar system, and so they put him on trial for it. And they made him recant his statement. It didn't matter if the entire world, and they did at that time, the Roman Catholic world completely denied the real science that Galileo Galilei had discovered. They made him recant it because their belief system was that the earth was the center of the solar system. That was their part of the theological belief system, among many theological errors that they have committed. But that's another story for another time. But the point is that one scientist, Galileo Galilei, with observation, can overturn the entire world at that time. And that's exactly what happened. Here's another quotation. This is from James Bales, Dr. J.D. Bales, longtime professor of Bible at Harding University in Searcy, Arkansas. He made the same point regarding the creation-evolution controversy. Quote, "If to be accepted by scientists, or any number or percentage of them," he noted, "is all that is meant to establish something scientifically, then the only scientific method would be to count heads. If more scientists accept a position than reject it, the minority has been outvoted and the scientific truth is whatever the majority says it is. However, this in turn means that all the talk about framing a hypothesis, thus testing of the hypothesis by the scientific method, the retesting of the hypothesis by another, and the significance of prediction is just so much ritualistic talk and is unrelated to science whatsoever. If enough scientists can be persuaded, regardless of that means of persuasion, that a certain position is true, the position has been confirmed scientifically." End of quote. That is exactly, ladies and gentlemen, what has been taking place in the academy at the university. And with the millions and billions of dollars flowing into these from the government in order to prove climate change and such things as that, therefore, when you have that money flowing into it, they supposedly prove that climate change is human-caused. Consensus science, by which is meant how many scientists believe something, is not science at all. It is in reality consensus among scientists. And as Jonathan Drose points out in his latest newsletter, excellent newsletter, he points out there's a major difference between science, scientific method, and the scientific concept, and scientists. To establish something scientifically, you need scientific method. Scientists believed at one time, for example, the earth was flat. They believed that Jews were inferior peoples. Some today believe in spontaneous generation, that life comes from non-life. Many believe in natural selection and mutation, that species change based on inherited characteristics. None of these things has been proved scientifically. In spite of how many Richard Dawkins of the world believe them, it has not been shown scientifically. It is a belief system, and it is unwarranted by scientific evidence. Consensus science is no science at all. Now, we'll take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about the left's assault on the scientific method, what's really happening and why they're doing that in just a few moments. Let's continue our thoughts regarding the left's assault on the scientific method. In an article written by John Drose Jr., just recently, matter of fact, this article was written last year, but his newsletter referenced it, his newsletter that comes out, and I hope you get it. It's really a great newsletter, John Drose, D-R-O-Z. And he wrote about the attack on the scientific method. And he tells us that the left attacks the scientific method because it supposedly promotes linear thinking. Those who do not think critically, he says, might be inclined to blithely accept that assertion. The reality is, number one, the claim is false, and B, there are several disturbing real reasons why the left is opposed to the scientific method. So let's pick up the first one, and that is how the claim is wrong, that the scientific method promotes linear thinking, and how that really is an underestimation of the scientific method. Drose points out the left's underlines specious, unjustified position is that linear thinking is inferior to lateral or creative thinking. But that claim, he says, is highly debatable. They never make an argument specifically about this. They have no argument for it. They simply say, well, that's linear thinking in a disparaging way and expect non-critical thinking students, parents, teachers, administrators will accept it. Oh, okay, that's linear thinking, therefore we can't, we ought to avoid it. That reminds me of, I had a professor one time telling me in a graduate classroom, he said, well, if you went to examine so many scholars, here's what they would say. It's just, oh, okay, we're going to count noses again. They just throw those things out there, but linear thinking, there's nothing wrong with linear thinking. Linear thinking is not a bad thing. It's not inferior to lateral thinking or creative thinking. Linear thinking is simply lining up orderly fashion, drawing conclusions warranted by the evidence. That's exactly what the law system should be about. We'll talk about that in a future show, but that's what's happened in the law system and lawfare is absolutely astounding, and we see it going on right now with Donald Trump's trial. But let's talk about some of the real reasons that the left hates the scientific method. Why do they hate drawing conclusions warranted by evidence? You see it in the New York trial of Donald Trump. You see it in Fani Willis in Georgia. They don't want to draw conclusions warranted by evidence. They have a political agenda. But this is going to the scientific method and why the left hates it. Number one, applying the scientific method exposes the fallacies of the key elements of the left's ideological program. Major matters like wind energy, climate change, COVID policies are examples that Jonathan Drose used. For example, if we use the scientific method and test the hypothesis wind energy is a net societal benefit, the answer is, that's the hypothesis, wind energy is a net societal benefit. The answer is a hard no. The left's response is not to discard wind energy as a net liability, as they should, but rather to try to dismiss the scientific method as meaningless. Isn't that astounding? That is absolutely ridiculous, but that's exactly the way the left operates. And that's what's happened in our public schools. We'll just add this one in here while we go along the way. School testing. That is, the objective testing, whether it be in the STAR testing in the state of Texas or whatever the state exams are, have revealed lack of learning and lack of knowledge in many different categories of students, particularly in minority students. So instead of beefing up the curriculum, beefing up the teaching, drilling down on the teaching and getting them to meet the standards that are there, because the students, many of them, and minority students are not meeting the standards, what are they doing? They're taking the test and they're dumbing the test down. I saw an article recently, and the article was written by Heather McDonald. She writes a great article in the Imprimis magazine. She points out that's exactly what's happening in law schools and medical schools around the country. The fact is that minority students are not making the grade in the law schools. They're not making the grade in medical schools. They're not passing the tests. And so a large majority of law students, medical students are white, majority population. But that cannot be. We cannot allow that in the woke ideology. Therefore, instead of trying to bring along the minority population educationally, they're destroying the tests. And you can get, in some states, you can get a law degree or law license without taking a test. Why? Because there's so many minorities that can't pass the test. The same thing is going on in the public schools. The public schools they break it down always. Here in Texas, the STAR test, they break it down. Here's the white population. Here's the Hawaiian population. Here's the Cuban population. Here's the African American population. Here's the Hispanic population. Here's the males, females. And it's always a very, very broad difference between the white majority population and the minority population. So instead of bringing them along, what are they going to do? Going to scrap the test? Something's wrong with the test. And by the way, we count smartness in other ways than passing a test. Well, maybe so, but not smartness in math, not smartness in science. This is absolutely ridiculous. It's turning common sense on its head. That's exactly what's happening in the scientific field regarding the scientific method, and that's what Jonathan Droz is talking about. That's number one. So applying the scientific method exposes the fallacies of many of the key elements of the left's ideological program. Wind energy, climate change, COVID policies, they don't meet scientific standards. Their political measures, their political program filled with fallacies. Number two, the left, John Droz points out, is adamantly opposed to critical thinking citizens, and they want robotic compliance. The scientific method is not just a scientific process, he points out, but is a universal problem-solving methodology. But they don't want people to be critical thinkers. They don't want people to be able to think for themselves. What do they want? They want people who are going to be able to goose step to whatever the leadership wants. And so one of the key tools that citizens have is critical thinking, the ability to critically think. And if the left can extract that from our K through 12 education, they've gone a long way towards diminishing our students' ability to do critical thinking. This is one of the key objectives of the left, to remove the scientific method from the scientific standards. Matter of fact, in some of the pages that Droz has, he points out, and you can look these up, you can look up this document, A Framework for K-12 Science Education, implemented by the Next Generation Science Standards, adopted by 49 states, which really erases the scientific method. Even in elementary, junior high, and high school, scientific method is not going to be taught. Number three, the scientific method, in combination with critical thinking, is an exceptionally powerful tool in enabling citizens to become more self-sufficient, competent, independent in all aspects of their lives. And that's why the left is strongly opposed to people becoming self-sufficient, independent, competent. They want citizens to depend upon them. So the scientific method is roundly attacked. And number four, this one absolutely is shocking, but I want you to hear this one. John Droz writes, the scientific method and critical rational thinking are supposed to be symbols of whiteness. For example, he has certain articles, and you can go to them, and here's one of them. This is from the Smithsonian. The article is, in Smithsonian Race Guidelines, rational thinking and hard work are said to be white values. This is written by Marina Watts, a staff writer, published in July 17, 2020, and updated May 25th, 2021. And here's the article, portion of it. The Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture recently unveiled guidelines for talking about race. A graphic displayed in the guidelines entitled Aspects and Assumptions of Whiteness in the United States declares that rational thinking and hard work, among others, are white values. So in the section, Smithsonian declares that objective, rational, linear thinking, quantitative emphasis, hard work before play, and other various values are aspects and assumptions of whiteness. The Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture had no comment for Newsweek. Newsweek had the article. They referred to the website's page titled Whiteness when asked for additional comment. The graphic was later removed from the page, but it's absolutely stunning that we would have a society that would accept that in any way whatsoever. It just shows you that race trumps everything in America. Here's something that was put out by the public broadcasting system, and the writer of it, or I should say the speaker, was Tyler Valentine. He said, why science is so white and why it needs to change. So the idea is that science is whiteness, or science is white. Scientific method, rational thinking, drawing conclusions warranted by evidence is white. Now let's just stop for a moment here. If that is true, if that's true, if that's where America is, if that's where Black or African Americans are today. You see what's going on in New York with the Donald Trump trial? They don't want evidence. They don't want drawing conclusions warranted by evidence. They don't care about evidence. That's white way of thinking. That's exactly what's going on here. This is why I say we're in more trouble than we might think. So, number 5, Jonathan Drolls points out, this is his summary of the whole thing. If the left is successful in dumping the scientific method, it then allows them an opportunity to fabricate an alternative methodology that incorporates some of their ideological objectives into it, and that's exactly what they are doing. They're injecting their ideological ideas into it. Just for illustration's sake. As I told you a few moments ago, in a framework for K through 12 science education, as well as the next generation science standards adopted by 49 states, we have some of the reasonings by the creators of it as why they dropped the science methodology or scientific method from it. And it was dropped, and so here's the reason. They have 5 reasons. Number 1, it was dropped from science standards by their predecessors. John Drolls points out that's not the point. The point is, why is it being dropped at all? Who removed it has nothing to do with it. Why has it continued to be dropped? The scientific method has passed the test of time for 4,000 years, and we are throwing away logic, rational thinking. B, here's another reason that the educators who wrote the framework for K-12 science education excluded the scientific method. They said the scientific method is undesirable as it promotes linear thinking. There we have it again, linear thinking. We don't want linear thinking, they say. Linear thinking, number 1, is not bad, but linear thinking is not the only thing that's involved in the scientific method. There's creativity. We have to think outside the box, but we have to align ourselves with rational thinking. Number 3, they say they are attempting to replace the scientific method with an improved version. Improved version of logic, improved version of rational thinking. Number 4, here the creators say, even though the scientific method has been deleted from the state science standards, it does not prevent a local teacher from teaching it. Well, technically that may be true. But nevertheless, it's not likely that many scientific teachers or science teachers are going to include it after so many times of being put through the colleges and universities where the scientific method has been excluded and where it is discouraged at the local level. That's just not going to happen. And number 5, almost no one, teachers, parents, citizens, scientists, conservative organizations, the legislators, media, has formally complained about the scientific method removal. So what's the big deal? Well, perhaps it is a case that people are asleep at the wheel. Perhaps it is a case they don't know what it is. They haven't been informed of it. But it is not science. It's not real science. If we're going to exclude the scientific method, there's not another way of rational thinking. But this is what the left is all about, to exclude rational thinking, logic, scientific method. That's going on in the public schools. It's going on in the universities. It's going on in the law schools. It's going on right now in the court system in New York City. That's what's happening, and it is the spelling of the unraveling of America if we can't stop it, and stop it now.